Hey, good afternoon, guys. We're going to do another book review today. Still on that English history kick. And we left with Dan Jones' book last week, and basically the fall of the Plantagenets, the rise of the Tudors with the Wars of the Roses. And this week I wanted to actually take a small snippet out of that 30 years of back and forth with the Wars of the Roses to specifically look at one very small 12, 18-month period of time with the book from Alison Weir called The Princes in the Tower, and the princes being the two sons of, at that time, the ruling King Edward IV. And so I'm going to kind of go through very quickly where we are in time and why I picked this and why I enjoyed Alison's book so much. I will say this is the first book that I've read from Alison. Dan thoroughly enjoyed, but Dan's kind of niche, if you will, are the Plantagenets. I wanted to move further. The original reason for picking up English history was to read about the Tudor reign. Wanted to start at the beginning of that, right, with the Battle of Bosworth. And so what I ended up doing was reading about 30 years prior, and then, of course, kind of all the way through to Henry VIII. That's really where the book stopped. It didn't go into Henry's children, and in amongst those, 500 pages, I guess, something like that, was this one small snippet that I really wanted to read more on. Looked it up. Original publication of Alison's books, like 1991. It was a very easy read. I'll say that because it reads like straight up true crime nonfiction. Very well put, well flowed, well researched, and I would say very well put on the level of being completely neutral and allowing you, if you will, to make your own case. She even updates evidence and kind of sums it all up in the last chapter, if you will, to explain the certain, we'll say circumstantial, maybe at that time, evidence that surrounded this incident, and follows it up with recent research that has been done. Again, at that time, I think the last revision of that was 94, something like that. So we've even had more found. And so I did watch a couple documentaries specifically on that period and that incident after reading the book. So this was my first Alison Weir book. I thought she did a very good job of making it read like fiction, while also, again, sticking to the facts, putting in the footnotes, putting in the research, and sourcing it. So very well done. And so in time, where we are is Edward IV is reigning. Edward IV has two brothers, and he also has two sons. And his two brothers, the Duke, of Clarence, and the Duke of Gloucester, are his two younger brothers, George and Richard. And so we find out essentially that the Duke of Clarence, George, is plotting behind Edward's back so many times that it goes unignored, to the point that he can't ignore it any longer. So he actually convicts his brother of treason. His brother is drowned in a vat of wine, red wine. And so his fiercely loyal younger brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, is his only direct kin left. Their father, Richard II, was some years before, and I actually didn't even read much about that in this book, in Dan's book, and certainly not in this one by Alison Weir. But anyway, we have two children by Edward. We have, again, a younger Richard, an older Edward, being Edward V when he comes to age of coronation. And so Edward IV dies. Edward IV is married to Elizabeth Woodville, which the Woodvilles are an infamous family of low birth that come up through the ranks and politics of England to become a very powerful family. And that plays a little bit into, I think, what we think happens, even though opinions are still split today. And we're over 500 years ago from that. So Edward dies. Edward IV dies. His 2 children are at 2 different castles. And now it becomes this thing of a race for time to get Edward back to London and sequestered, if you will, for protection purposes. And so what you essentially have is Richard, his brother, Edward IV's brother, being told on Edward's deathbed that you are protector of the realm now, which means this, I think he was 12 years old, 11-year-old boy is going to come underneath your protection until he becomes of age. And so Richard, being fiercely loyal to his brother, takes this very much to heart and very seriously. And the last thing that he wants to do is give the Woodvilles more power. And so he seeks out to go and quote-unquote rescue, let's say, Edward. Because at the time, Edward, the son, who is going to be Edward V, is at the castle of Elizabeth Woodville's brother, which was Edward's tutor. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of the same names. Bear with me here. A quick Google search will probably do a better job than I'm doing right now. But Richard III, essentially, because he does become king, ends up getting Edward, bringing him back under his protection, putting him in the Tower of London through a series of other political savvy events. Grabs the younger brother as well, which was with his mother at the time, Elizabeth Woodville. He grabs the other Richard, puts him in the Tower of London, again under protection. And then we start to see kind of Richard unwind to the point of essentially going to Parliament and telling Parliament that he deserved to be king. He even goes so far as to have I don't remember if it was a bishop or a cardinal, come and testify in front of Parliament that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was completely null and void because Edward IV was already married. And this bishop had performed that ceremony a couple of years before Edward even met Elizabeth Woodville, which made their Edward and Richard, their sons, bastards. And so that means that Richard III deserves to be king. He is next in line, and Parliament goes along with this. Maybe not supportingly so, but trying to establish balance back to England at the time. They essentially voted him in and allowed him to be king. Again, he keeps telling everyone, at this point in time that the boys are safe and the boys are in the tower and the boys are referred to as bastards. And essentially, after a specific date, they are no longer seen from the Tower of London. And that's kind of where the story ends on the surface. We don't know what happened to them officially. We don't know if they escaped. We don't know if they were murdered. They certainly were never officially recorded to having been seen again necessarily. However, we will see some imposters throughout the years. And so we have a 3-year reign, I believe, by Richard III, wherein he is eventually killed on the battlefield by Henry Tudor's army, Henry becoming Henry VII. Now is the first king of the Tudor dynasty. And so, of course, his privy circle, if you will, his council, decide that they're going to try to find out what happens to these boys as well, because, of course, they find these kids alive. These kids have a direct line to the throne. We might have more civil war in England because of that. They cannot find them. Again, we kind of fast forward a little bit. Henry Tudor marries Elizabeth Woodville's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. And so we kind of allow Henry to reign for quite some time, and then again we get these two imposters. One was kind of weeded out very quickly. The second one, Perkin Warbeck, you can read in the book, took a much longer period of time and energy, and was eventually beheaded because Henry VII ultimately was not entirely sure who this individual was. And you have a lot of inner workings within that. You have relatives saying that Percy was the younger son. No one ever tried to pass themselves off as Edward V, but the younger Richard, they did. And so we get to this point where even, Elizabeth of York, which would have been their older sister, is not quite sure, even though depending upon what book you pick up, they may say she was very sure that there was no way this was her brother. However, one of her aunts is the one that takes this boy in, kind of raises him up, if you will, and parades him around to these different countries to say, I know this is my nephew. And a lot of countries get on board for this because, again, this is a York. This is going to reestablish the York reign that was there before with the father, Edward IV. And so what we have is this situation of not knowing what happened to these two boys, knowing that Richard would potentially been able to lay even more solid claim to the throne if he would have paraded these boys around, if they were in fact dead. And so you get into this situation of reading the evidence and saying, okay, well, he didn't do it himself, but did he have someone else do it? Well, what would have been the advantages, disadvantages to that? Versus there's theories that Margaret Beaufort, which was Henry VII's, right, the first Tudor king, which was his mother, might have had something to do with that to make sure. She was so fanatical for her son to be put on the throne that she wanted to make sure, to ensure that anybody and everybody as far as claimants to the throne would be wiped out. There's more people than that get wiped out, but we're not going to get into all that. And so this was a 380 some odd page book that kind of goes through that and presents the evidence like you were on trial, like you were reading a modern day true crime book written by the prosecutor, if you will, of the trial. And so again, it was very well put together. It was very easy to read, and it made a ton of sense the way that she allowed the book to naturally flow. She is of the belief that the Tudor, biographer, chronicler at that time, Thomas More, she thinks has the most accurate account. He actually time-stamped certain things with the people that he spoke to and said that Richard, in fact, did have an individual suffocate the two children. We find out some 300 odd years later, I think it was Charles II, one of the kings, is redoing the Tower of London. We end up destroying some steps, and 10 feet down we find this trunk, and this trunk has the skeletons of two children in it. And there was, again, a lot of back and forth as to who they might be. Could it be a box from Roman times? No, that's kind of thrown out because of the fabric found in there. It wasn't even around at that time. Okay, could it be, other individuals? Those weren't the first children put in the Tower of London. Well, probably not, because the clothes they had on was only, worn by regents and very wealthy individuals. Okay, well, let's try to age date them. And they did an okay job for the time period, and they could definitively say that these were preteens, maybe 8 to 10 and 10 to 12 when they were looking at the two ages, and I believe it was 11 and 12 or 10 and 12 were the actual ages of the two children. They found blood on one of the lower mandibles. At that time, they said that was medical evidence of a strangulation, which is what Thomas More claimed happened, was that pillows were used to suffocate the children. I believe he said at exactly midnight on that date in July. And so it was more or less, I guess, put to rest and confirmed at that time that Richard, in fact, did have them killed. Fast forward, we have a mock trial in Britain in the 1980s of Richard III, and they present evidence, and he gets acquitted and found not guilty, if you will. So we have this back and forth of the Richard III Society, which is a society in Great Britain, to try to protect his reputation, if you will, since, between Thomas More and Shakespeare, Richard III gets this very villainous and monstrous hunchback, evil, murderous type of king stigma, and in fact, is it true or not type of a thing. And so she deals with all of that. Alison does. Again, really good book. We find out that Richard III was found in, 2012, I believe, under a parking lot, and confirmed that he was basically just thrown in after humiliated on the battlefield into an empty hole. And around that time, the two boys were again disinterred and asked to have a re-examination of their body, where the medical examiners, historians, archaeologists, more or less come to the same conclusion, and they were from both the U.S. and the U.K. And so, again, fascinating, complete, probably the most mysterious deaths in at least English political history. So I wanted to read something specifically to that, even though it was a small snippet in Dan's book. This one was an entire, nonfiction novel dedicated to that. It was a great, great read. Again, don't know which one I would pick over Dan and Alison, but I'm going to keep going down this road. 91, probably a 9.1 for me on the scale here of ranking. I just started another Alison Weir book, so I'm moving into Henry Tudor now. So we were looking at the 6 Wives of Henry Tudor. That's what I'm reading now. That's a 700. That's a big one. It's a 700 pager. And so what I might do in between is actually go back and review old books that I read at the beginning of the year that are fiction, to kind of put a placeholder in here so that I can keep my weekly one up for you guys. But I think that'll do it for me. After Alison's next book, after Henry Tudor, I've got to figure out if I want to do his children, his family, to include maybe Mary Queen of Scots and King James I, or actually go back and read the book on the Plantagenets for Dan. I'm not exactly sure which direction, I'm going to go, but I will go in both directions eventually. So it's going to do it for me today. Again, great book. Do yourselves a favor. Maybe watch a 15, 20-minute documentary on YouTube, see if it fascinates you. If it does, pick it up. It's very cheap on Kindle, and 380-page book, not bad at all to get through. All right, that's going to do it for me today. Have a good evening, guys. We will see you next time.